This show was previously broadcast live on ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com.
Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind, where we explore the culture of consciousness through science, mysticism, psychoactives, and general cultural technological weirdness. I believe that expanding the mind is part of our nature. It's part of the nature of human beings. We like to do goofy things. We like to explore the edges, and we do it since we're kids. But I think it's also something about consciousness itself, if we can make a distinction between consciousness and human beings for a moment, as many metaphysical and spiritual people do, that it's in the nature of consciousness to explore its own conditions, to tweak and tinker with the underlying mechanism that produces itself, that the ultimate mystery for consciousness is its own activity. And one of the ways into that activity is to find ways to shift it, to change it, to undermine it, to expand it, to trick it. And this impulse goes really deep within us. I think we can all remember, especially when we're kids, things we did, well, just to get high, just to play with experience. Rolling down a hill, I think, is a very interesting example because it's something kids love to do and makes adults want to throw up. And yet, clearly the experience is not going to be too terribly different. Obviously, there's something about young brains that take to rolling down hills a little bit better than old fogies. But the same basic principles is operative. Another thing I remember when I was a kid is I had these blinds in my bedroom that had vertical stripes on them. And I discovered that if I stared at the vertical stripes, the stripes would begin to produce the illusion of ascending, like they were, barbershop poles that were twisting and moving up. And it was like I went on a little elevator ride into illusional space. And I could remember even getting hallucinations off of it. So I would enter into some kind of fantasy world where other kinds of images would happen. I think all kids do this. And all people have this impulse in them. And what happens as we get older is, as is the case with almost everything we do, it becomes kind of routinized. We find certain set ways of experiencing this need for consciousness expansion, and then it becomes kind of a routine. So in our current society, it's perfectly acceptable to jack yourself up on caffeine every morning. It's less acceptable to take nicotine, but it's not that big a deal for most people in terms of you're not going to get a lot of social opprobrium for it. And then of course alcohol, where we have a routinized way at certain times of the year, at certain days of the week, certain kinds of events where it's just a social acceptance that we're going to tweak our consciousness in these set ways. But all these ways get kind of tedious because part of the point of exploring the edge of consciousness, of rolling down the hill, of staring at the weird visual illusion, of exploring different compounds in the natural world, of doing different meditation techniques, for example, is to do something new, is to explore in the novel experience of consciousness something fresh, a new dimension. And that's why there's this sense of expansion, because any place you get is not enough. We're going to keep on going because we're human beings. That's what we do. We keep pushing the boundary or finding another map. So while getting high, or the idea of getting high, tends to be seen as just sort of a frivolous thing, I actually believe that in some ways it's really at the core of what consciousness expansion is doing, or what consciousness sort of wants to do. And it does it through intellectual ideas, as well as through tons and tons of practices and engagements with plants, with illusions, with novel experiences, with travel, with spices, with food, with sexuality. And when you start to see it in that larger framework, when you put it into a bigger picture, it really opens up the meaning of these things and it puts a little bit more seriousness on them, as well as I think they should, and that's a lot what we're trying to do here on the radio show. Let's see, Maja let's bring on Maja, our Expanding Minds esoteric librarian. You must have captured tons of lore about various ways that human beings have gotten high or expanded or tweaked their consciousness over the centuries. Am I right that this is something that you've been interested in?
Oh yeah. And what I find is that it's never ending. It's like you say, you can do it with anything. Kids can do it with like something on the wall, rolling down a hill. Like it's extremely simple. And a lot of people that will like come in to do research, they'll think it's like it's always related to drugs. And I'll say, well, actually you can just spin around in a circle for an hour, like the whirling dervish, and there you go. Like just spin around in a circle. It's very simple to get into that ecstatic state. Like altering your state of consciousness is very easy. Anybody can do it. But that part of retaining conscious awareness while you alter your consciousness, that's when we get to the good stuff, like when we get to the point you were talking about with expanding our consciousness and getting into the tricky stuff where we start to get to that creative intelligence. And, we really start to push the limits of what our potentiality is. It's when, to me, I think it's when we start to navigate in those crazy altered states that's where the good stuff is. And I always kind of refer back to a lot of the trickster stories when I talk to people about it. And there was a great book called Trickster Makes This World by Lewis Hyde, and in there he talks about how creative intelligence that helps make reality and how consciousness tests itself is usually done through these tricky ways, like a trick of the light, like an illusion, like you said, how you can look at an optical illusion and it kind of tricks your brain into thinking something else. And then, you can go into this literal expansion of your conscious creative intelligence.
Yeah, I think that's a really awesome point that I suspect we'll get to later, is that it's not just about exploring or experiencing these various altered states or tricks of the mind, but developing, in addition to that, an awareness about how consciousness works under one's own consciousness, one's own experience works under different kinds of conditions. Because if you start to develop that, and it's easier to do it with things that are extreme, with magic tricks, with altered states of mind, with mild euphoriance. It's easy to recognize, I'm in a different space now. Well, what does it mean to be aware of this space as well? And
right.
As you develop that, then you can keep that awareness, that kind of awareness going all the time.
Exactly.
And then you recognize that your whole life is full of these slightly modulated, mood, belief-fulfilling, conceptual tricks that you sort of lay across reality, or gets laid across your reality by social conditions, and you begin to cultivate that awareness as a thread throughout your experience, which is one of the great gifts of exploring this kind of material.
Yeah, and that's totally what Richard Smalley talks about in his new book. Our guest that we're going to talk to today is how it is. It's just this kind of total trick that consciousness continually expands and plays with itself, and just kind of bounces things off of itself in order to learn and grow,
Well, with that, I think I'd like to bring on our guest. Our guest is James Nestor, and he is the author of a new book called Get High Now, and there's a little appendix at the end there, Without Drugs. So we're not talking about drugs exactly, although we will be getting to that issue later on in the chat. James, thanks so much for joining us here on Expanding Mind.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
I think you're in San Francisco, correct?
I am indeed. Yep.
All right. Well, that's a good place to be for this kind of topic, I'll have to say. I'm also San Franciscan, and I have to say, I when I first got your book in the mail, I was a little dubious, because I tend to dislike a lot of the books that people publish now, where there's lots of little bits. It's the sort of soundbite influenced book thing where there's a lot of interesting little things that are all kind of collected together. And a lot of books come out that way that I find disappointing. But I found your book to be excellent. I was very surprised at the amount of stuff I didn't know about, because this is a field that I'm very interested in. And I thought you did a great job of balancing historical information, humor, and a genuine sensitivity and exuberant spirit towards the ongoing quest of exploring these peculiar minds and bodies we have. So I think it's really quite a triumph. So thank you for writing it.
Oh, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. Yeah, the main thing is I just didn't want it to read like some homework assignment. Some of this stuff is pretty heady. The history is pretty rich and deep. But as long as it wasn't like a lot of work to access this stuff, that was the whole point. And people can take this as a springboard to go anywhere else they want. And that was sort of the concept behind the book.
Yeah, and I think that worked really well. And there's enough meat in there that draws you in. I mean, one of the reasons I find whatever you want to call this sort of genre, a book with lots of page or page and a half long sections in it with different subsections that your eye can grab, is that it allows writers to be lazy and to just develop a certain kind of superficial tone and kind of skate over some of the more difficult things, because it's like, oh, well, I only have like a page to do. And there's really quite a lot of depth and deeper connections between the different things you do. And I also like the way that you organized it so that different genres of mind tricks or ways to get high are brought together. So you'll have a plant and then a meditation technique and then an audio thing, rather than putting all the audio together or all the visual tricks together. It makes it a much a richer, multidimensional kind of experience.
Well, I'm not saying I'm not lazy. I'm the laziest person you'll ever meet, so I'll just clear that up right now. Another thing we tried to do with the book was to have really practical stuff. Like 2/3 of the book is practical stuff you can do at home, in your office, in your car, on the train, wherever. And about 1/3 of it was stuff I just came across, which was absolutely so weird and or fascinating that I wanted to include it anyway. And that, we put in the bucket of more anthropological, historical oddities, stuff you should not do, but rather that is just fun to read about. So I just want to make that clear. I've gotten some reactions of people picking up the book and turning to page 60 and seeing Schizophrenic's blood, and they're like, oh, I should go out and try to get some Schizophrenic's blood. No, do not do that. But it's fascinating how that can actually, if someone were to do that, might have a real profound mental change, provoke something in them. And we get into the details later in the book. I won't bore you with all that.
Well, can you talk a little bit about why? Is this your first book?
Yep, this is the first one.
How you came to this, and what was it in your own experience that led you to want to create a book like this?
Well, it's funny. I actually had no intention of writing this book. I've never written about this stuff before. I don't consider myself a mystic. I've done yoga about twice in my life, but I found a stack of notes in an estate house that my family had inherited. And my uncle had lived there, and in the 60s and 70s, he was a pretty wild guy. But he had collected thousands of different ways of altering consciousness, most of them without drugs, a lot of meditations, breath work, insects, stuff like that. And I think he lost interest in this in the 80s, but he kept this stack of notes in this back closet, and I found it and started reading through it, and it was just so absolutely bizarre that it interested me. As a journalist, it interested me. I usually write about stuff like alternative fuels and much more, pragmatic stuff like that. But I took the notes home, and as a joke, I actually tried out a couple of these breathwork things with some friends, strictly out of curiosity. We didn't think anything was going to happen. And before you know it, everyone was just like, whoa, that was amazing. Like, we felt good. It definitely altered consciousness, and started checking out the history and the science behind it, and became really fascinated with it.
So in a way, that does kind of justify the laziness, because you had a lot of the research done for you.
Not necessarily. The stuff that my uncle had, I used that in and of itself as a springboard to investigate other areas. And I did. I won't tell you how many days I spent at the library looking up this stuff. But I just used that as a reference. It was more or less an idea of like, hey, there might be something in here. This could be a really fun book to write. Try to do it in a different way, not to do it in a typical way where it'd be with a ton of weighty language and done. And as I was saying before, like, it would take a lot of work to access this stuff, but to write it in an accessible way that people who would otherwise not be attracted to this stuff might have access to. And
was your uncle a peculiar fellow, or did he just have this sort of interest? Was he?
Pardon? I'm sorry.
Was your uncle a peculiar fellow, or did he just sort of have this interest among many other things?
He was an eccentric fellow indeed, into some really interesting stuff. Along with all these notes were about, and I'm not exaggerating here, about 2,000 antiques in his house, from suits of armor to, pre-Christian statues. I mean, really crazy stuff. Cool guy, though, at the same time. So
was he a Californian?
Yeah, this was in the Hollywood Hills. Where else?
There you go, baby.
You collect all this stuff, in a Neutra house on, the top of a cliff near the Hollywood sign. That just seemed like the most fitting spot for it. And so it was a pretty amazing experience going through all that stuff.
Do you think...
Go ahead, Maja.
I was just going to say, did your uncle ever talk about ever having any altered states or any of his personal experiences, or it was just kind of something that was shoved in the closet and kept in the dark?
He did. He wasn't a very mystical dude. He was, pretty successful businessman and sort of hung around those cultures. But I remember when I was young, this was probably in the early 80s, he mentioned that he had been really concentrating on doing a particular meditation. I don't know which one it is. I wish I would have known. But and he managed, according to him, to get out of body. And he said it scared him so much that he stopped all meditation and all research in this stuff.
Huh.
So there you go, whatever that means.
Interesting. So tell me about the High Lab. I think this is a really interesting and important aspect of this whole realm, is that it tends to work better when you have a circle of people who are exploring and trading notes. So how did that develop when you did the research? When you're doing the research?
I was like I said, I was coming into this stuff from left field and didn't know anything about it. So I collected the most skeptical people I could find, people that had absolutely no interest and no history in doing any of this stuff, and got them together on an occasional Sunday or Tuesday night in my house, and we would try this stuff out. This included audio entrainment exercises like binaural beats or theta wave entrainment, breathing exercises, and then I'd send them home with a little homework assignment of like lucid dreaming exercises or some sort of substance. Don't worry, it's all legal stuff, like cheese, and I would have them report on this. So it was really fun, and there were a lot of people fighting to get into the High Lab after a while. But what we experienced, after, I would say 80% of these things really worked with everybody. That's when I was like, wow, we're kind of onto something here.
Yeah, that's particularly remarkable with some of the meditations that you found, and that seemed was one of the more, well, there's a number of interesting things about it, but that was one of the more interesting things for me was how you went through and you managed to extract specific kinds of meditation exercises or visualization exercises that usually come embedded in a whole sort of worldview, a Buddhist worldview or a yogic worldview, and you really kind of honed in on a few practices and mentioned them, and that seems pretty interesting. But the fact that people who are coming from whatever they're ad designers or whatever they are, not interested in this kind of field, and they would do these specific practices and still seemingly have some very powerful results, like the Kundalini meditation you have in there, where it sounds like people really just like had very powerful experiences without any kind of pre-investment in that world. I mean, because a lot of people who do that stuff, they go in there and they're already telling themselves that this could be magical, it could be mystical, it could change their lives. There's a guru who they believe in who's saying, yeah, this is really powerful. And so there's a bit of suggestion that goes on in a lot of spiritual exploration for a lot of people because they're seekers. But I got the sense that the High Lab had a more cool attitude towards those larger narratives, and therefore had a more striking results in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think it was interesting to sort of strip all the dogma away from any of these religious, a lot of these are tied to Buddhism, even some are to Christianity or Hinduism or whatever, and to strip all of that out and say, we're just going to sit here and do this, and whatever experience you have is going to be your genuine experience. You're not trying to attain any oneness with, any particular God or anything. You're just trying to focus in and alter your consciousness and see where it takes you. And I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. After a while, though, I have to admit, after about the fifth one of these labs, the power of suggestion was working pretty well because people were actually expecting something to happen after a while because we had such a good record so far. And there's nothing wrong with the power of suggestion. I mean, placebos work, and intent, causes a chemical change in the brain. So that's a pretty interesting thing as that goes along. How much that tied into these things versus how the exercises actually worked, I don't think it was too extreme. Nonetheless, I can't totally discount it, especially later on.
Did you personally or people in the high lab have experiences, particularly on the more meditative tip, that shifted a little bit, perhaps their view of the world, of the underlying, whatever this nature of consciousness, its relationship to the body, the possibility of there being other dimensions in a more real way than you might think of before? In other words, did any of these moments of getting high, the insights that came or the experiences that came, end up feeding back into people's worldviews or their experiences in a more general sense?
I think so. Kriya breathwork was this breathwork meditation. What that is it's a paced breathing meditation you do along with a yogi who leads you through this. That had a pretty profound effect on everybody, especially one guy who was so apprehensive about all this stuff. And, we did this for 30 minutes, which is a long time. And I just said, everyone stick through it. If it sucks, you can say it sucks, but just try it. It's 30 minutes. It beats watching TV or something. And he was really, really changed from that, I think. And he started pursuing stuff like other meditations and yoga. And what was interesting is I started checking out the science behind this particular breathwork meditation. And in the past 10 years, there's been a bunch of studies done that shows the physical, not only mental, but physical effects that this has on people. Like it increases immune function, reduces stress, and weird stuff starts happening, like it reduces cholesterol in your bloodstream. These are real things. This isn't some sort of yogi hearsay, someone telling you something's going to happen. It really happens in your mind and in your body, and it feels great. So that was a pretty profound experience that he had, and I think everybody else had too.
Did any of the folks relate an experience of oneness with God or like specific religious experiences? I know you said that you took out those parameters going in, but did you find that people had that experience anyway, even though that wasn't dictated by you?
I'm not sure. All of that is very subjective, and I don't know if they would consider it as that. Being that this stuff was so new, I don't know if they were considering that they reached a really altered state of consciousness or just a sort of altered state of consciousness because they had never done any of this stuff before. I'm sort of hedgy with that stuff myself. I don't know exactly what it means. I guess when it happens to you. So maybe it didn't happen to me, but some other pretty profound, interesting things did. And so we wrote about that in the book also.
Well, it's also the case that sometimes those things can happen, but they happen in the same spirit with which you approach, which you in general you've approached things, which is just like, you don't know, you're going to do these things to your body, mind. The brain does amazing things, and some of those things can be a sense of oneness with all reality. But that ends, and then you're back on your sitting pillow or whatever, and you're like, what am I going to do with that? Some people build up a whole belief structure based on that, and some people see that as just part of the endless exploration, where part of what you're exploring is the underlying mechanism. I mean, it's like you say, you're not just looking at the practice, but you're looking at what can we say about it? What do scientists say about it? What does it say about our brain? What does it say about our nervous system? So it seems to me that one of the qualities of this kind of work, as a deeper work, is that you simultaneously are pursuing experiences that might be beyond your worldview or might suggest something more metaphysically interesting or unusual about the world, and that at the same time you keep one foot in a kind of experimental, almost scientific attitude, where you're comparing notes, where you're trying to understand different ways of explaining these kinds of things, and sort of keeping open to both sides. I think is a very fruitful way to explore this kind of material. I had another question for you, or a comment, and I was trying to get more examples from the book, and I couldn't having gone through it, I couldn't think of too many more. But I like the way that you've included some things that are sort of unpleasant. There's like the window roughing is a great example when the window's down in your car and it starts to vibrate, and it's kind of annoying, and it's like people usually like fix it, and you make a point and say no, but the true experimentalist will keep on going, and then you'll find that it actually starts to affect your brain a little bit more, and you can kind of spin off, and of course if you're driving the car, that's not a great idea, but for the passengers it's fun. But in general, there's also like there is a whole realm of like experiences that aren't really pleasant, but they're kind of interesting, and that's something else that I think developing a taste for is actually it's a very rich way to approach a lot of things, because you're going to be undergoing unpleasant experiences one way or the other. Were you conscious about putting things in there that were more weird than fun?
Yeah, definitely. I want to go back to just a quick point that you had said about subjective experience and objective experience. This was something that I was really adamant about. I know that there's been so many books about people that have written about certain memoirs or their subjective experience, like having an out-of-body experience or, having some profound spiritual enlightenment. That is amazing for them. That's great. I don't want to take that away from them. But for someone like me, it doesn't say too much to me. It just doesn't have that much weight to it because it seems so one-sided. So something I was very adamant about doing in the book was to have as much objective information as possible. What does science say about it? What do a bunch of other people say about it? What does history say about it? And at the same time, we're telling you sort of our experiences through a subjective lens, but also the vast majority of the book is like, hey, this is what's established, and you can take this and do what you want. So I just wanted to sort of establish that. As far as the harmful stuff, a lot of those examples sort of fit into that anthropological, historical bucket of stuff. Like, I don't expect anyone's going to smother themselves with honey and go try to get a bunch of bee stings on them to hallucinate illuminated grids, as people do when they're stung a lot by bees. These were just interesting things. And, there's a few meditations, breathwork exercises that specifically don't make you feel so hot. And I think the reason why we included that is because when you're not doing that, you realize how good you can actually feel if you're breathing correctly and if you're not stressed out and if you're calm. So that was it's a little side trip into maybe how other people may feel or how you would feel if you weren't healthy, and it makes you appreciate things the way they are now.
Can you tell us, what was your worst trip that you had in your experimentations, or that, other people did too, that they just didn't like it, that was kind of a bummer? Like, was there a particular method that just was consistently a drag?
Well, there was one, that's an interesting question. There's one called theta wave entrainment, and this was an audio loop that was created in the 50s by scientists to lull the brain into this certain theta wave state, which is the very creative, visual, vibrant state. The thing is, when you listen to these audio loops, they're extremely unpleasant. It's really loud, it's harsh, it's not nice. It's almost painful on the ears. But what you get from that at the end, if you listen to it for about 5 minutes, is so completely strange, because these things actually work. The military use them to help people concentrate. And you can listen to these on gethighnow.com. You can go on there and listen to them for free. But I think that was one in particular where I remember everyone sitting down, and I was like, okay, I got a new one for you. Start the iPods, here we go. And people just protesting within a minute, just saying, wow, I'm not going to listen to this for 10 minutes. But they did, and at the end of it, they were just like, wow, that was amazing. So it's not all easy stuff.
Yeah. I just want to say we're on Expanding Mind here, and we're talking to James Nestor, the author of a new book called Get High Now Without Drugs, and he did just mention the website that comes along with the book, which is fun on its own, gethighnow.com, and it has lots of audio and visual tricks or highs that are lots of fun. And if you want to call into the show to ask James a question or make a comment, we're at 888-873-4643. And you can also email to mind, M-I-N-D, at techgnosis.com, TECHGNOSIS.com. enumerates.com. And just to talk a little bit more about the website, which is, it's also nice to see the way that people integrate web stuff with books. And I think this is a really perfect medium for you, because you can add an interactive element right away, and then you're also representing the book online. But I also thought it was just really cool and interesting the way that a lot of these visual and audio highs, as you call them, are usually treated as sort of illusions or tricks. And so usually when you encounter them, maybe somebody sends you a web link, or you're reading a psychology book, et cetera, et cetera. You see these things and you're like, oh, that's cool. That's sort of interesting. It kind of tells us something about the mind. But reframing them as highs is actually a pretty fun way to do it, because it sort of reminds you that A, they're a lot of fun, B, they are experiences that are in some sense illusions, but they're rich as experiences. And then they also do that thing that we've just been talking about, where they simultaneously, you have an experience, but then you also have an illumination into the underlying mechanisms of consciousness and how it's not exactly the way it might appear. So I thought that was a really fun way to go. And I'm kind of curious, did you start off just thinking about breath work and meditation and maybe mild, compounds as ways of getting high, and then went, wait, there's this whole world of like audio illusions and strange effects with your eyes. Doesn't that count? I mean, how did you make that link?
Yeah, I think that some of those were just so completely weird to me. I had seen them before, but I was like, I started talking to a neurologist and a doctor about this. I said, why do all of us see this certain illusion this certain way? What's happening to the brain? And it essentially, those things, to me, just show how absolutely fallible our brains are and how malleable they are. When you're looking at a two-dimensional picture of something and it is completely opposite of the way it should be in real life, that's a pretty interesting thing. And it just, again, it just shows how, how our eyes can interpret things differently and send signals to our brains, and how our brains don't know how to process so much information. When I was checking this stuff out and talking to a neurologist, it was interesting what he was saying, how just about 80% of everything we know of our constructed reality in our brains is made up in our brains. Only 20% is taken in through senses. Well, that's pretty amazing, because it explains how people see things so differently. And I thought that aspect of the illusions, and we do use the term visual highs pretty loosely. Whether or not these are illusions or visual highs, that's completely up to the person reading into it. But I thought that those sort of gave us a little window into this world of how different things can look to different people.
I think that kind of ties in with something Erik was saying earlier about the importance of new experiences and using highs to have a new experience, because in that way you're not relying on that part that your brain makes the world, because it's something that is totally coming in through your perceptions. And when you use these audio-visual highs, it's perceptory, and then you're kind of forced to think in a different way. Like, did you find that through these perceptive ways that they have the biggest effect on the way, like, kind of, or I might say alteration of the way your brain works?
Well, I think that one thing that was interesting about them is, as opposed to some of the other methods where people really have to take some time and some effort to go there if they want to go there, with a lot of these visual eyes, you just look at them, and no matter who you are or where you come from, you get what's going on there. They look weird, and they mess up your vision for a little bit, and people who are prone to certain seizures, shouldn't look at them too long for a reason, because it has this effect on the brain. So I think that it's sort of a neat starting point to this whole looking at all this stuff. You can start there and be like, hey, that's weird. Why is it weird? What's happening to my eyes and my brain? And that's why we included them. I wanted to have them on a website in full color so that people could see them in large view, and people who don't buy the book can just stumble on there. There's something like 1 million people a month now going to the site, which is so weird to me. But I guess I'm not doing my part to help out the U.S. recession here, because I think a lot of people are wasting their work days on this site. Feel a little guilty about that, not so much, but
one becomes very aware of that as being a freelancer. You're like, hey, who's doing all this web stuff all the time? Oh yeah, they're working.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
But I'm also curious to take that a little bit farther. one of the things I liked about the book, and maybe this wasn't even your intent, but is that as you go along and you start to become someone who's interested in all these things, you see how they work, you start exploring some of them or whatever. What you're also inculcating is not just like, hey, there's all these fun things to do, and why not? It's better than watching TV. But again, it's this kind of self-knowledge where you start to see the way, you get the immediate insight into the way that different conditions in your brain, different conditions of perception, produce experience that is evanescent or delusional or otherworldly or euphoric. And to my mind, at least for some people, this ends up developing a deeper or at least different sense of self-knowledge, and that self-knowledge itself is really kind of the ultimate high. It's that in any situation, in any condition, there are these factors that are producing your experience, and a lot of them are not what you think they are, like how much of our perception of the ordinary room we're in is actually being sort of run on the fly by our brains, just sort of filling in things because they don't have to make any changes. And the more you look at it, the more you realize what a construct it is. That this kind of self-awareness develops in a way that's really potent. I think that's one of the most important things that people continue to develop as adults. Like a lot of our models of reality and things are developed as we're children and then adolescents, and a lot of people kind of get cohered into their worldview or their belief system or their jobs and all that kind of stuff. But that as adults, one of the things we can keep doing is to keep becoming more and more aware of just how our experience is constructed, and that really helps us engage a lot of the things that are coming down the pike, different ways of viewing the world, different attempts to manipulate perception, which we see in marketing, we see in all across the board. I'm curious if you found, as you were doing this sort of research, so less about any spiritual experiences or changes in your spiritual worldview, but really more like actually the way that you go through your daily life, the way that you go through the way you experience your own perceptions and experiences. Has that changed in some way because you've immersed yourself in so many of these alternate ways of producing experience?
Yeah, it really made me realize, after the months of working on this, how completely numbed I was to this way of thinking or this way of seeing the world. And I know a lot of people think that that's flaky or, you're dropping out because you're, not thinking about work all the time or, taking a day to pay your car insurance. But to me, this is sort of homing in on big questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And I think that day-to-day tasks have done such a good job, especially in our culture, of completely numbing us to this sort of philosophical thinking, to sitting quietly in a room alone for 30 minutes is going to seem so weird to so many people. People are going to be like, oh, you've lost your brain, dude, you're turning into a hippie or whatever. But, this is a basic human need that I think we're completely depriving ourselves of. I would not have been saying this a month before starting this book. At the end of it, I sort of had that realization. I was like, hey, this is the real stuff. This is what's really going on, and we've done such a good job of obfuscating it to, the sidelines of freakishness that we don't bother thinking about this stuff anymore. And that was sort of, another impetus of the book, is to get people who don't think about this stuff or have no interest in it, and to sort of give them a conduit that they can look into the stuff for a little bit. I'm not saying dedicate their lives to it and move to Sedona or whatever, but they can dedicate a little time and be like, hey, there's larger things going on. Reality is mostly constructed in our brains, and relax a little bit and try these other things out. People have been doing them for tens of thousands of years for a reason, because they work and because they give you a larger context to life.
You're here.
Well, and that's a very kind of profound realization, and through all your work on this book and these experiments, a lot of the things that I would think about as you were describing them is how deeply that infiltrated you. And I know you said, obviously it's kind of gotten into your head, so to speak, in that it's, affecting the way that you see the world and things like that. But would you say that you find yourself becoming more consciously aware, even in little moments, while you're doing things, if you're, doing dishes or having sex or going down the street? Do you kind of implement these techniques? Have you found that the techniques work themselves into your everyday life now and kind of increase your consciousness? Like, have you found that effect on yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can say honestly yes to that in a pretty big way. This is, as I had said previously, this was not stuff I had an interest in or was even exposed in. But now, that I've found it, I can do these little tricks when I'm bored occasionally. I now go to a breathwork thing a couple times a month in the city. That's a great thing of living in San Francisco. There's all these things to choose from. And this is not stuff that, I would have done before. And I found the benefits to be huge. I mean, even as far as applying it to my work life, I can think so much clearer and write so much better having known this stuff. And this book actually parlayed into a much larger book that I'm working on now that's due in about a year, in which I'm going all over the world to Sweden, Switzerland, India, Norway, and looking into the science behind alleged spiritual experiences. A lot of scientists think they found this area in the brain that provokes spiritual experiences, and I'm balancing that science with more 1,000-year-old holistic approaches to this. And my friends and my editors are cracking up because this is not my beat, and it was not something that I've been working on at all. They're just like, oh boy. But I'm keeping it extremely pragmatic and objective because, again, I don't want to. Those people who are writing these memoirs of spiritual enlightenment, I think that's amazing for them. But to me, I didn't have too much access to that. I know other people don't either, so I'm trying to take a very different tact.
You know that Horgan book, Rational Mysticism?
I don't know it.
Oh, you should check that out. That's great. He's a scientific American writer, but he's interested in these kinds of experiences. He wrote a great book about psychedelics and about mysticism and mystical experience, and he talks to a bunch of high-ranking mystic types, and Ken Wilber and Terence McKenna and all these crazy characters. But his approach is really beautiful, and I think it's a really important approach. I've come to it through, I think probably the more controversial question I have for you in your book is really about the idea of without drugs. And I can understand from a journalist perspective or a marketing perspective, you want to create a book that has nothing to do with all the drug rhetoric and all the various ideas and associations that come along with that, or drug culture itself, and also very much to emphasize how many marvelous, wonderful things we can do that have drug-like effects without being illegal substances. And yet, in some ways, you are talking about drugs, or rather, you reflect on the whole issue of what is drugs. What does the word mean? Why is cannabis a drug, but kava, which is included in your book, is not really a drug? Well, they're both drugs, or they're both not drugs. And I understand pragmatic reasons to do that, and even from reasons of personal experience, as you mentioned in your introduction, you were just never interested in more traditional drug culture or whatever. But my question, or a little bit of my issue about it, comes from the fact that the kind of thinking that you're representing in the book, the kind of balance of exploration and skepticism, but a kind of open-hearted exploration of consciousness using all these wonderful means, to my mind, would lead once more towards the desire to reframe and create space for a more rational and self-reliant way of approaching drugs, rather than sort of bracketing them off and say that's over there and that's not what we're not interested in. So I'm curious if you thought about that too much, if you actually care very much about that debate, or was it more of a matter of expediency, or because when you got to that point where you're including kava, but then you include the toads, but you say I don't, you don't want to smoke the toad venom, and you're like this line that you're kind of negotiating that's sort of implicit in it, which, if you come from my perspective, where I've been very interested in the history of psychedelics and all drugs, really, and a lot of my interest has to do with the same kind of issues that we've been talking about. So I found your book to be very much simpatico with a lot of ways that I've come to think about these explorations. So for me, it was a little odd to see that line be drawn, and I'm just kind of curious how you thought about that or how you approached it.
To me, it was something like, how interesting would it be to put like methamphetamine? Take methamphetamines and get extremely high right now. I mean, everyone knows that happens, and it's a very obvious, easy thing to do something like that. And I think that's pretty general knowledge. As far as bridging like between kava and marijuana, for instance, it's a totally valid point you're making, and something I mentioned in the introduction of the book is like, how do you distinguish between muscarine and DMT, these things that, are definitely drugs that get you, quote unquote, high, and coffee and herbal teas and so on and so forth. And I was very honest, and I said I distinguish these completely subjectively.
Right.
Stuff that I thought that was coming out from left field that people didn't know about, that was interesting, Russian reindeer urine. People get high from that. That to me was really interesting because it's like, how did that come about? What's the history behind that? Cocaine or methamphetamines? I don't know so much. I don't know how interesting that would be. And also another side note is I've seen a lot of people, and I know this is a personal anecdote and this isn't some objective statement here, but I've seen a lot of people do drugs throughout my life, in college and so on and so forth, and it just looked, people that got really into this stuff, it looked so boring to sit around and, watch Star Trek or Twilight Zone for 8 hours in a row, or to watch some dude do coke in the bathroom of a bar and then gnash his teeth all night. And I was just thinking, is there, more of a healthful way, in a way that doesn't have a hangover to do this stuff? And I know that's probably not the answer you wanted, but that's just sort of was my approach to this.
No, I'm just curious. There's no judgment. I'm curious. Have you checked out the website Arrowhead?
Yeah, I did, and they have some really interesting, fun stuff, and that's where actually some of the stuff, like I heard about the toad venom, smoking toad venom, and some of the other stranger anthropological, like animal highs, were on there. It's amazing, such a fascinating site. I think it's so interesting.
Great. No, that seems good. I was just curious about that. Yeah. Then there's ants. That always seem to be. I met somebody who ate ants. I met an anteater. I mean, I met one of those guys, like you said earlier, about like nobody's going to go out and get bee stings, and I'm like, well, actually, there are people like that. I've met them. They'll pursue anything that has an anthropological.
One interesting thing about ants, and again, this was one of those things that, to me, this was the impetus of the book, is like unearthing weird facts like this. The same ingredient that gets cats bonkers off of catnip is also the ingredient in ants, and was the reason Native Americans ate ants to get high or to induce dream visions. So I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. And catnip tea is a big thing in India. You can have some catnip tea and I guess have your own little mini light Indian dream vision.
I didn't know that. I thought catnip didn't influence us. Interesting.
It certainly does. Yes,
and I even pulled yesterday. I pulled a trick out of your book. I did some basil. I chewed some basil. I was having kind of a rough day, and I was like, screw it, I'm going to chew some basil like the guy told me to do in the book. And it was nice.
People have been doing that for thousands of years. Good antiseptic for the mouth. Mouthwash. You look like a cow. I mean, what other benefits do you want?
Hey, James, I wanted to ask you something which I think invariably comes along when you write a book of this nature. Do you feel like, or have you had any response on people actually trying some of these more dangerous methods? I know that you absolutely present them as a way that it's interesting and to look at it historically, but is there any kind of fear that you'll present this and people will try to do these crazy things, and that in some way you might have some kind of responsibility for that?
That was certainly something, the editor and I had talked about at length, and we thought by announcing in the largest, boldest print humanly possible, do not do this, we would get the message across to people. I compare those things to, again, the anthropological oddities, where an analogy I used is reading about those and understanding them would be like looking at old surgical tools in a museum, like things that are fascinating to understand and to look at and marvel at, but things you would never, ever want to do. And that's how we equated these, and I think we set the line pretty clearly. Again, I don't think anyone's going to be taking the next flight to Sudan and tracking down giraffe liver. Actually, Eric's friend, maybe, but maybe he's the only one on the planet. So that was basically the approach to that. I think that people can be pretty responsible for themselves. There's disclaimers all over the book. For instance, if you have problems with asthma, maybe you shouldn't do 30 minutes of breath work, from the get-go. I think you can use your own gauge at the same time to help you do that. The very dangerous ones are listed very loudly and proudly. Interesting, one other note I want to make is I got an email a couple of weeks ago by a guy that was really sort of pissed off. He's just like, hey, I got your book, and it's totally fascinating, but none of this stuff works. And I wrote him back, and I said, well, which ones did you try, and why didn't, I was curious how they didn't work. He's like, well, I didn't try any of them, but I can just tell none of them are going to work. And it just goes to show, it's just like anything. You have to put a certain amount of effort into these meditations and breath work exercises and audio exercises, be it 1 minute, 5 minutes, or 10 minutes. But you have to kind of want to go there. And if you allow yourself to do that, I absolutely guarantee these things are going to slightly alter your consciousness and make you see things differently, at least for a little while.
I'm curious, of course, and I'm going to get to just sort of, these are the obvious questions you would ask, of the sort of euphoria, calming genre of things. What was the one that you were most impressed by, or even have integrated into your ordinary life the most?
Well, this one's going to sound so extremely simple that people will probably think it won't work, but people have been doing it for thousands of years, and it's been working for me. You can take, and anyone can do this. You can do this right now, sitting in the studio or at home or wherever, but you can just take your right thumb, place it over your right nostril, keep your mouth closed, breathe in and out very deeply through your left nostril, and that is called moon breath, and it's something that the tantrics have used, again, for millennia, and it has an extremely calming effect on the body. You can energize the body by doing the opposite, breathing in and out through your right nostril in the same way, and that's called sun breath, and that stimulates the vasomotor system, opens the capillaries, so on and so forth. And all of this stuff, again, has been checked out in scientific studies, and it works. So that's a fun little one. I have one other one. Do you guys have time for this? I'll try to keep it brief.
Yes, yeah. We've got a few more minutes.
Okay. And I think this one was so completely strange to me. And this is one of the first things I did when I first started researching the book, and other people did this too. But Thomas Edison and Benjamin Franklin and even Einstein used hypnagogic dream state, also known as hypnagogia, to solve the majority of their problems, mathematical problems or patents or whatever they were thinking of. And what that is it's the state right before you go to sleep, when your mind is just flooded with things that happened that day, with vibrant imagery. But the problem is this state happens right before you go to sleep, so you usually forget about what happened during it. But they developed various methods to lull the mind into the state, and one of them, and everyone can do this when you go to bed tonight, it's going to sound weird, but you're going to do it anyway. All you have to do is, when you lay in bed, is to put your arm up perpendicular to your body and just fall asleep. And what will happen is, when you actually fall asleep, your arm will fall down on you and wake your body up, and you will remember everything that transpired in hypnagogia. And it's very creative, weird stuff, and a lot of people use this to work out problems or just to trip out and have fun.
Yeah, it's a great trick. I've heard versions of that, but that's definitely the most the easiest one, the simplest one that I've heard.
Yeah, and the first time I tried this, I was apprehensive. I was trying to go to sleep, my arms up in the air. I was just like, this is so stupid. My dog's looking at me weird. But it completely worked. And then when you wake up from it, you do it again and again, and it's so much weirder than anyone will believe until you actually do it. So do it, everybody. Do it.
Hey, Erik, do you have any little tricks that you do every day for, like, consciousness shifts?
I'm trying to think of, like, actual... It's not so much specific tricks like that as just having developed a habit of, looking at my experience as if it were, as if it were kind of an illusion or kind of a trick or kind of something that was produced through some weird practice. But I guess the one thing that I will notice, and there is something like this about in James's book too, is about reacting to smells. He talks in the book about the amygdala and how it's giving these extra signals that are saying, like, if you smell something yummy, it's like, yeah, go towards that. And if you smell something nasty, it's like, no, get away from that. And you can almost feel the kind of click when you have this response. And partly because I have an extremely good sense of smell, sounds like it might be fun because it is probably true that my food tastes better to me, flowers are nicer to me than you. But it also means that I have to deal with a lot of ambient, unpleasant odors. And so the way I've dealt with them is to actually become incredibly fascinated with the way that the brain or mind says, get away from things like that. And so one thing that I do is when I start to have like negative reactions is I get really fascinated with what it's actually composed of. What does that actually feel like? Buddhists talk about this too, where we have a story of pain in our heads and we're like, oh, that thing's causing me pain, pull back. And if you're like, yeah, but what is the pain? What does that word cover? Well, it actually covers a series of sensations. Maybe it's prickling, maybe it's heat, maybe it's, and there's a way to decompose our initial reactions, sensory reactions to strong stimuli, and to go, wait, well, what was actually behind that initial story about what it was, and maybe you discover actually a much richer and often less plus or minus kind of way of experiencing the world. And I do that pretty much all the time because it just fascinates me. And I find that it makes life more pleasant and it creates more space around things, because things that are either like obviously unpleasant or in some ways obviously pleasant, like typical boring reactions to sweets or whatever, like, oh yeah, I love that. Oh, I love that advertisement of that attractive woman or whatever, like these sort of dumb ways that we respond to stimuli. If you develop more and more awareness of them as kinds of tricks or kinds of highs, really, that are coming down the pike, you can have there's more room around it. So that's something that I've definitely integrated into my life.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because why do bad, quote unquote, bad smells smell bad? How is it that our brains are wired this way to understand those things? And even considering that thought in and of itself sort of opens up your worldview to larger issues, and it makes the world a more fun place to hang out in, personally, I think, because it just shows you the variety of different things, and again, how fallible the brain can be in certain ways.
It's amazing how plastic that thing is. The more and more you learn about it, the more and more you're like, oh my God, we're just like running. It's its own little virtual reality simulator running haywire most of the time. How about you, Masha? Is there some little short thing you can mention? We have about a minute and a half.
I do a little quickie that I learned from Tibetan Dream Yoga, where you look at your hand periodically throughout the day and you say, this is just a dream. And that's a lucid dreaming trigger that helps you start lucid dreaming, and that's worked really well for me.
I think James has that in the book, too, or a version of it.
Mm-hmm.
There are 4 different ways to induct lucid dreams at night, and some of them are extremely basic, and they totally work, and I was so completely freaked out how well they worked that I won't get into that. I know we're running out of time, but they really work. I know it sounds like I'm on
freaky.
Some commercial, some ad, but they really do, and they're so much fun. I love that hand one. I'm writing that down right now for book 2.
It totally works.
That's great.
I will give you credit, I swear.
Well, we've been talking to James Nestor, who wrote Get High Now Without Drugs, and it really is a very worthwhile book. There's tons of exciting ideas. It's really well written. It's got lots of good illustrations. That's something that I'm going to be telling folks about. And the website is gethighnow.com. And James, thanks for being on the show.
You guys, thanks so much. This was so fun. You guys were asking such different questions than the 30 other radio interviews I've done, so this was an absolute blast. I really appreciate it.
Well, good, and nice to hear that, and good luck with all your publicity and all that in your next
All right,
book.
thanks a lot. Have a good day.
All right, Maja, are you doing a tour soon?
I am on Halloween. We're going to go all the spooky places. You can check it out on godismyboyfriend.com.
Excellent. And I'm at techgnosis.com, and Expanding Mind is out of here for now. And next week, we still don't know who we're talking to, so you tune in. All right, folks. Bye-bye.